Okay, well, it's my great pleasure to welcome Marian Miller, who's our Climate Justice Design Fellowship speaker today. Marian has been a lifelong educator, and she focuses on the hyper-local aspects of the environment, ecology, and equality. And she addresses both individual educational and societal impact through her work. She helps people to see and understand how ecological factors in the environment impact their own communities. She's been most recently the education program manager for the Mystic River Watershed Association, which is how I got to know Marian. And in that capacity, she works with student teachers and administrators throughout the Mystic River Watershed of Eastern Massachusetts, which includes parts of Boston, Cambridge, Medford, Somerville, and surrounding communities. Marian earned her master's in education from Tufts University, and she's been a mentor in our CJDF program working with Laura. So Marian, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, Nathan. It's interesting to hear a summary. So thanks for telling me about all the things I have done, which is great. So I'm happy to be here today to talk to you about education, sort of around the corner through environmental issues. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Mystic River Watershed Association, which, as you had mentioned, I have been affiliated with for 4.5 or almost 5 years, which has been great. I've done other environmental education work before that and other education beyond that. So I feel like I'm a lifelong learner and maybe a lifelong educator. So there you go. I have a slideshow I'm hoping to share. And yeah, I think it's going to work. Maybe. You guys see it?
We see your whole PowerPoint window. Yep. Okay. Perfect.
Awesome. Okay. Well, we're off to a good start then. I love it. Okay. Well, so the Mystic River, as Nathan had said, is located in the Boston area. The Watershed Association is a relatively small but mighty organization that does environmental work and, kind of social justice work. It has evolved into, including a really intense focus currently on climate resilience for obvious reasons. So I'm going to talk about the Watershed Association. I'm going to talk about the Mystic River, and I'm going to highlight a couple of things that are really of interest to me from an educational perspective. So that's how it's going to go. I've got a lot of pictures and I have a lot of words. So there'll be time at the end if anybody has any questions. I put some links in the chat, which you may have seen, that will probably be useful somehow as I'm talking about different aspects of my work. Okay, so, well, the watershed certainly is a host to wildlife. That's number one, any watershed, ours in particular, which for some reasons that'll become apparent shortly, seem ironic. And the watershed is also a place for people, and the Watershed Association has advocated for both for 50 years now. This is a bucket brigade, helping river herring to get over the dam. And the dam has since had a fish ladder installed, which the Watershed Association had a hand in. So I put that in there because people and the environment have been important historically to the Mystic River Watershed Association. So here's the Mystic River. This picture was taken in Medford. Again, it's the rivers in Greater Boston. Looking towards Boston, you might be able to see the skyline of Boston, the buildings. And this year, the Mystic River Watershed Association is celebrating its 50th year, which seems amazing, I'm sure, to all of us involved. It was started in 1972, kind of in response to the ecological disasters that rivers were facing. The most, I guess, relevant in that way in the late 60s, early 70s was the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland that was on fire, that caught people's attention as an ecological disaster. Absolutely. I will say, as an aside right now, I could look out the window and see the Cuyahoga because I happen to be traveling and I'm in Cleveland. So that story is really relevant to me right at this moment. But the Mystic is a beautiful river in many places. It's a highly urbanized river in other places, and it's not very big. The actual river is only 7 miles long, which as rivers go is not big at all. And so small river, but important in so many ways. So Massachusetts isn't a big state, you would know that. And so not a lot of land mass to begin with. We're a very small watershed. Maybe I can use my arrow to kind of highlight the Mystic River Watershed right there. It's so small, its name can't even fit on its location. Basically, the land mass is about the size of Brooklyn. There are about 700,000 people that live within the watershed. So it is a small watershed, a short river, and a lot of people. So ecologically, that means a lot. And it also means a lot to climate resilience. So the Mystic River ends up in the Boston Harbor, important. If you live in the Boston area or you have visited the Boston area, you probably know a whole lot about the Charles River. It's a very famous and very pretty river that has parks along the edges. It's iconic and everybody knows it. The Mystic River, which is over here, if you can see my arrow, comes into Boston Harbor about the same place as the Charles River. So the Charles River is the iconic river. People know it, people walk along it, people recreate. And the Mystic River, much shorter. The Charles River is, I think, 44 miles long or something like close to it. So the Mystic River is short and not well known. And if people know it, they know it as the dirty river, the industrial river, the working river. So I call the Mystic River the working river in the Boston area. And without that working river, life in the Boston area would be kind of hard. So not viewed as important, not iconic in any way, but certainly important. And when we're thinking about climate resilience, especially challenging, and I will continue to talk about that. So when the Mystic River Watershed Association first began, the idea was to improve water quality. Like I said, there was a lot of focus on water quality issues in the 70s for rivers. So when the Watershed Association began, it was 2 professors at Tufts who wanted to improve water quality in the watershed. So since then, the Watershed Association has volunteers that goes out once a month and gathers water from a variety of locations throughout the watershed, tests it. So we have years and years of water quality data. Every year, the EPA puts together our data on a water quality map, and this map on the side is the water quality report card. The river gets one every year, and I would have to say that's an awesome education tool because everybody is interested in the river getting a report card. That just seems like an unusual hook, and yet it's super important. Not just students, but adults are interested in that. So right now, the water quality in the Mystic River is better than it has ever been. It supports a variety of wildlife. The watershed as a whole is a very dynamic ecosystem for people and for wildlife. So as I said, 700,000 people live in the Mystic River watershed. It's a small space. It's one of the most urbanized watersheds in all of the Northeast, which is remarkable. But I guess if you think about how small the land mass is, how short the river is, it all makes sense. So I think if you think about a lot of people in a small space and a small river, that's going to lead to a lot of challenges for the river. People are not necessarily the best thing for a healthy environment. And there are a lot of people close by the Mystic River and within the watershed. So there is a lot of infrastructure that is in the Mystic River watershed. There's a working port. New cars, particularly Subarus, arrive into the Boston area on giant ships and are offloaded on the Mystic River. Oil, heating oil, gas for cars, jet fuel. You might have noticed on the picture of the Boston Harbor that Logan International Airport is within our watershed. The jet fuel comes on big tankers and is offloaded in the Mystic watershed. Road salt. So in the winter in New England, we use a lot of road salt because of the weather to keep the roads safe. That is all shipped in and offloaded in the Mystic watershed. So a lot of infrastructure. So this is the lower Mystic looking at Chelsea from Charlestown. And there are two bodies of water that you can see. The one closest to the bottom of the screen is called Little Mystic Channel. And you can see it's been channelized. That's not a natural shoreline. And that would be true of almost the entire length of the lower Mystic has been channelized or filled in or made, been manipulated, which is true for most rivers. So Little Mystic Channel runs into the Mystic River. That's the closest. And if you look under that green bridge, which again is the iconic Mystic River Tobin Bridge, if you live in Boston or have visited Boston, you will have seen that bridge. Right underneath it, there is also a body of water, which you can barely see, and that is the Mystic River. So lots of industry, lots of buildings, lots of roads, lots of housing, very, very densely built area, which again has led to a number of challenges for the river and the watershed over time. So the name Mystic was taken from an indigenous word, Missituck. The great tidal river is how it has been interpreted. The Mystic River Watershed was home to the Massachusetts, the Nimtuck, and the Pawtucket people before the Europeans arrived in the 1600s. In the 1600s, after the 1600s, when the Europeans arrived, much of the activity was based around European needs. So one thing that happened along the Mystic was shipbuilding. This is a ship called Blessing of the Bay that was built in Medford. There were multiple places where ships were built, and it was fine to do that. That's quite a ways upriver from the Boston Harbor. Because the river was tidal, at high tide, you were able to float a big ship out into the harbor. The river in most above Somerville, which maybe doesn't make sense if you don't live in Boston, the river is no longer tidal, which I'll get to in a minute. So again, an important river, shipbuilding right here, Mystic River. The Charles River that's so iconic and well known is not very deep, and it's a very slow moving river. And I believe that's why the Mystic became the industrial river, the river that was used for industry, for people's needs. So one of the needs, of course, was energy, and tide mills were important sources of energy. This is Slade's Spice Mill, which is located on the Chelsea Revere line. It was one of the oldest mills in the Boston area. They ground spices. The company still has, it's not in business anymore, but it still has one item that is common, especially around Thanksgiving. It has a turkey spice rub that is still common. So this was one of many tide mills that was along the Mystic that powered early industry. And this picture, we're skipping forward to 1974. So much industrial activity happening on the Mystic. And I just chose a few images, but over time there have been iteration after iteration after iteration of industry along the river. Here they are building the liquefied natural gas terminal. You can see the Mystic Bridge is under construction there. A lot going on. It looks like a hazy day. I would say maybe pollution is a piece of that story, both air, water, and soil. Some people might know about the big Boston Harbor cleanup, also connected to a lot of the industrial activity that happened in the Boston area, the Mystic River was more used industrially than other rivers. So there's a connection there too. So here's an aerial view of the Mystic River as it goes down into the Boston Harbor. You can see some relics of its industrial past and some current. Right here, the electrical station is being decommissioned this year, and that parcel will be renovated soon. There are plans for a number of big projects along the Mystic River. So blank spaces along the river are places that were industrial in the past. There is a casino that's not in the view in this picture that was built relatively recently on a brownfield. And so development is happening along the river. There's not a lot of open space left that's waterfront in the Boston area. So this is kind of prime development land, which is difficult in several ways. First of all, pollution. The soil is not necessarily okay to build on, so there would be remediation that needs to happen. Most of the developments that are going to be happening are more high-end developments and displacing communities who will not be able to afford to live there anymore. Within the Mystic Watershed, there are a number of social justice communities and environmental justice communities because of the industrial past. That was space where people were able to get less expensive housing. A lot of immigrant families, a lot of poorer people, a lot of displaced people end up living in the lower Mystic River. And so the development is both good and problematic in that we're displacing people, improving things, but displacing. So one of the things that the Mystic River Watershed Association is focusing on is creating parks and paths. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Parks and paths along the river. You can see several parks here. So one purpose of the parks along the river is to provide some space without built infrastructure. So when the river floods, which is happening more and more often, there's a place for water to go. There also, one of the goals that we have is to have continuous parks and paths along the length of the Mystic, very much like the Charles River also has. It's a work in progress, but there's been a lot of progress made by my colleague, who is a landscape design architect and has sadly recently moved on to a new job, but she worked very hard and we're replacing that position. So it's a piece of the agenda for the Watershed Association to make the watershed and along the river's edge, welcoming and accessible to people, which it really hasn't been because it's been so industrial. In the foreground is a dam that stopped the river from being tidal. So that's the Amelia Earhart Dam. And that creates a barrier for the tidal flow, which, is a mixed bag environmentally. So there's still plans for future parklands along the river. This is one design. I'm not sure that it's the design that's going to be, but it's one design that could happen along the shoreline. There are multi-projects that will be housing, some of which it will be below market rate, but not all. Some people have referred to these parks, and I can't quote who it was, but I've heard several times these are latte parks, where you take your high-end coffee and enjoy it, which is, again, I think some of the message about gentrification of areas. So it's kind of it's a juggle between making things accessible, but also keeping communities together. So that's one of the thoughts. This is a relatively new park along part of the Malden River, which runs into the Mystic River. This summer, youth gathered for a youth summit on the environment, which is pretty awesome that those things are happening. We were partners with an organization, Green Roots in Chelsea, and their youth helped to organize a leadership conference, and they wanted to have it outside. So we facilitated outside along at a park along the Malden River, which is not yet public, but soon to be. And at the end of this get together, it was a gathering, they played games, they got to know each other. It was kind of an informal group and informal meeting. But the feedback from everybody, they were asked to fill out a form. The feedback from the participants was, thank you so much for letting us enjoy this park. And I think that speaks volumes to people wanting access to parks. And these are young people who don't have necessarily access to parks or all parks, because they live in communities where parks are harder to come by. So I thought this was interesting, and our staff was kind of conflicted. It was not an event that I happened to be at, but that our staff was conflicted. Like, should we be doing something formal, or should we let the youth do what they want to do? You know, let them guide it. And they guided it. And really, we learned a thing or two. They needed to be in the space. And that was so true. Glad it could happen. All right, so Mystic River Watershed Association started out with a couple of people and a lot of volunteers, or a few volunteers. 50 years later, 14 paid staff, and these are probably 7 summer fellows, and involved in so many things that the originators thought we might never be involved in. So the focus has kind of shifted from water quality and biodiversity. Still, those are important to us as an organization, but it shifted to climate issues, pollution in different ways, I guess, than it used to be. We have a full-time watershed scientist. We have a full-time climate resilience person. We have a full-time climate resilience associate. We have a full-time community organizer. We have a full-time landscape architect, and a variety of other people, including educators, sort of social media and outreach people. So it's a happening thing, small but mighty. The watershed is small but mighty. And I think some really interesting things have been happening. So as an educator, my job was to create education programming around our initiatives. And I think that's exciting. I think that's super exciting, because they really had to be hyper local. We're not talking about what's happening in Brazil, although people need to know what's happening in Brazil. We're talking about what's happening right outside your door. And students, and I think adults to some degree, know quite a bit about exotic, unusual things that maybe they'll never see, or projects that are happening that are good to know about, but you will never be involved in, but so little about what's happening right outside your door. So it's exciting to me to have the opportunity to connect people with projects and ideas that are happening right here in the watershed. And so that's one huge benefit of this project. So I want to talk about 2 different things that the Watershed Association has done in the past 5 years. 2 very thoughtful, I believe, projects that have led to, I think, important educational connections. So the Stormwater Collaborative, I'm going to talk about first, and the Resilient Mystic Collaborative, I'm going to talk about second. So stormwater runoff is the biggest source of water pollution in rivers today. So connected to climate, because we're having bigger, stronger storms, there's more runoff. And so there's more water in the system, systems get backed up, some are still connected to sewers. So creating many, many problems. So it's connected very strongly with climate resilience. So storm drains lead directly to the closest water body through pipes underground. It's invisible, you don't think about it. Before I worked for the Watershed Association, I had no idea that water that went down a drain goes directly to the water body, untreated, unfiltered, whatever goes down that drain is in the river. I never knew that, and I thought I was pretty savvy. So to be able to share that information, like here's this big outfall right there on the river, and there are many, is important to know. Students are kind of idealists, and I kind of like that, and they're also not so jaded, especially when they're younger. They're up for learning about this. It's not disgusting or gross or, oh, it's so depressing. It's like, oh, tell me about this. And I have learned so many things from sort of that fresh outlook in general, but with climate in particular. Anyway, so what goes down that drain comes out in the rivers. People don't know it. The labels on storm drains that say no dumping empties directly to waterways doesn't speak to people. It doesn't really tell you the story. Like, please don't drop your dog poop down in there. Please don't pour old cooking oil down there because you don't want to clog up your sink. Please, you know, be mindful that this goes right into the river. But people don't know. So the collaborative was a very clever idea. All the communities in our watershed, the 21 communities, were invited to join this collaborative. They had to pay to join, and about 10 of them did. And the benefit of joining was that quarterly, each community would convene with each participating community could convene with the others. It was face-to-face when we could and virtual when we couldn't. And so town engineers, city engineers, DPW departments, environmental people within each city and town that participated could get together. So in New England, especially in the Boston area, each city and town works independently. They don't talk to each other. They don't have time to talk to each other. They don't have time to collaborate. They don't have time to problem solve. But this is a watershed-wide problem, and we're united by the boundaries of the watershed. And so, like I said, half joined. They paid to join, and they went to quarterly meetings. And those meetings gave people an opportunity to share challenges and successes and talk things through. And many, many exciting things have happened because of the meetings. Arlington has a model of doing trenches around trees. So when they plant new trees, they dig up the ground in certain places where it's close to the stormwater system, and they fill the trench with gravel, and then they fill it in so that there's an infiltration of stormwater into the ground and not necessarily right directly into the storm drain. Then they plant the tree. So the tree gets water from the trough. A very clever idea. Low lift in terms of cost. And they got that funded, and we were partners with them, and several other communities also tried that model. Several communities have very thoughtful green infrastructure. Cambridge is one that's put in some great rain gardens and green infrastructure in many ways, and they come to our meetings of the Stormwater Collaborative, share what they're doing, and other people share what they're doing. And so there's this education thing that really is people who are doing the work telling other people what the challenges are and what the successes are. So in terms of education, that provided us also with the opportunity to create educational programming. So part of the benefit of being in the Stormwater Collaborative is having us create social media posts. And here's an example of one. So if people understand what stormwater pollution is. So clean water tip, clean up trash, leaves and other pollutants. And then the byline, which I didn't put on this image, is stormwater carries those things into the storm drain. So there's a quick, easy way to help people to know about this, because people really don't realize the problem. So that's for general public. The communities that are in the collaborative can use these tips. They were created every month for a period of time. There have been short videos, there have been informational pieces. We share it on our social media, and so do the cities and towns. So that's education in such a simple way. This was this week. So the city of Somerville has started creating these green infrastructure fixes for stormwater pollution. This one is at a Somerville Park. They posted this series of public education on Instagram, clearly. We pick it up and we spread it, but communities are getting the idea that there's ways to help people to understand the problem. And I think that's critical. These are some really clever fixes, for lack of a better word. And they're sharing that helps everybody. So I think that that's been a big benefit of the collaborative. Then the other benefit of the collaborative is if you are a member of the collaborative, your participation financially supports student education. So that's my jam right there. So any community that has bought into the collaborative can have 4 and usually more stormwater pollution in school presentations, for lack of a better word, interactive, kind of cool. I'd like to say they're always well received. When I first started doing stormwater, I thought this is not going to be a winner, and it has been a hugely successful project, in part because students want to know about stuff and they have so much to share. So this project I'm going to tell you quickly about was at the George Cavarian School in Everett. Everett is a social justice community as defined by income, language, and density of population. So this project, I'll tell you first, I went to them with the help of sort of a mutual friend and said, we're doing this thing, do you want us to do it for you? So the town connected us, the city connected us. The science head said, yeah, that sounds interesting. It would fit the curriculum in 5th grade, but we really need an engineering component. Okay, well, this project didn't really have an engineering component at that time, but we talked. She pulled in a teacher who had some information, and we created this project that was really so awesome. So we went outside in the schoolyard, 5th grade, looked at the storm drains, counted the storm drains, watched water run into storm drains. One day it was raining and we actually went out. That's like unheard of in public school, and watched the storm drain. We created models of natural systems and watched water percolate through the soil. We looked at the trees, we counted trees, we found out how come trees are useful to stormwater pollution. We did a number of different outdoor related kinds of things. We did a survey of what pollutants do you see in the schoolyard, which trash is usually the one you see, but it's not necessarily the only one, but it's the one you see. Then the teacher talked to the students about the engineering process. So here are the steps in the engineering process. Then the students thought about storm drains and drew diagrams of what they might do to a storm drain or catch basin system to reduce the amount of pollution. So here are 2 examples of students who drew up their design. Then the students got together, chose elements of each design that seemed to make sense to them. In groups, they built a model of sort of the merged together ideas. And this took days. This was an 8-session program, again, unheard of, but resonated with every kid. The teacher said when the parent-teacher conferences happened after this, she said every parent asked, what about stormwater? What is stormwater? What did the students do? So here we've impacted the teacher, we've impacted the students, we've impacted the families, none of whom had any interest or knowledge about it until we did this project. They created public service announcements that they took home and they also shared around school. So they're extending what's known. This was hugely impactful and local. It's going right to their local water body. We looked at maps and figured out where the stormwater was going. So that was a great outcome. Then the other thing that the collaborative does is works on projects with communities. So we're often partners, and often that partnership brings money, or we're part of the funding matter. So that building right there that you're seeing sort of on the left-hand side, that's Slade's Spice Mill. It's now housing. It's no longer a mill. It's several hundred years old, the building. And the project that's happening here is the removal of, you can see a small barrier here that basically serves as a dam. So this part of Chelsea Creek up here is one of the more polluted parts of the watershed. And it's because the river's tidal here. Chelsea Creek is tidal, and the tidal water can't get over here twice a day. On super high tides, like the big moon high tide, it probably can, but it can't. So they're trying to remove this barrier, which has turned out to be easier said than done. But we're partners with the city in working on that project. So there is some connection. Slade's Spice Mill, I'm sorry, that's a tongue twister for me, probably shouldn't exist now. I think if you look at the projections of flooding in the near future, that building shouldn't be there. It's likely to be flooded multiple times. That's a whole different story. So that brings me to the resilient Mystic Collaborative. So the Resilient Mystic Collaborative is similar to the Stormwater Collaborative, only its focus is on climate challenges. So 21 communities, every single community is involved, and many other partners, including Homeland Security, EPA, federal and state, the T, who's our transportation authority, all involved in thinking about climate issues. So on multiple levels, it really was a very clever thing. And my colleague, Julie Wormser, was critical in pushing that through. So it's a group that meets together and tries to solve these big problems. So as you can see, coastal flooding is going to be a problem in our watershed. It already is a problem. This is a coastal flood 2020 100-year storm projection. Most of these low-lying areas that are going to be flooded used to be salt marshes. The marshes have been removed to make room for people and infrastructure. But it's a really interesting project. This is actual Mystic over its banks several years ago. I think that was 2018. That's the power plant that's being decommissioned that you saw in the other photos. And so it's a real thing that's happening. And it's exciting that this group can come together and do it. And there's money for education, student education, public education within the context of this project too. So I get the job of talking to students, usually middle school or high school students, about climate resilience right in their own communities. And I think that's exciting, really exciting, because they think about things differently than we do. So the other thing that's happened with the Resilient Mystic Collaborative is that they have raised a lot of money to help solve many of these problems, or at least think about how to solve them. So 8.6 million, that's not enough, but it's a good start. Lowland flooding is also a problem that the group is addressing, and actually heat, which surprisingly is not something we think about in the Boston area as being a health concern, but as far as public health goes, heat and heat-related illness is the more critical problem when we're talking about climate resilience. So not this past summer, but the summer before, we worked with the Museum of Science to create a heat map of the Mystic River Watershed called the Wicked Hot Mystic Project. And this is an actual heat map where community members helped us to gather data about the hottest spots. And as you can see here, the lower Mystic has a lot of hot spots, not much green space, very few trees, a lot of paved surface, and a lot of infrastructure. In all ways, it's a very highly built area. And this is a satellite view of the watershed, and you can see the green part is treed. Those are trees that you're seeing, that's the green part, and the lower Mystic really, and the satellite view has very little. So a lot of things happening with people working together, but also people sharing information, which I call education. And right here, right now, I think is a very exciting thing. So I started off by saying that the Watershed Association began by being interested in water quality and biodiversity. I'm happy to say that right now, water quality is better than it's ever been, as I've said several times, and wildlife is thriving. And people are as well. We're working on the problems that exist with the people who live in those areas, and I think that's critical. And by the way, if you happen to be around the Mystic Watershed, bald eagles are a common sight, which is really kind of a renewing story, happy ending, whatever. So that's kind of my spiel, and that's the Watershed Association, I guess.
Thank you, Marian. That was fantastic. I love how many positive aspects there are to this story, how much has changed and improved over not just 50 years, but just the years that you've been with the association. It's wonderful.
It's a fast track organization that I feel lucky to have been connected to.
Thank you for sharing that with us. I know I have some questions, but first let me turn it over to anyone else who would like to chime in. Well, if it's helpful to get things started, maybe I will ask a question. I'm really interested in the Wicked Hot Mystic work. One of the things I think is exciting about it is that it's simultaneously a community engagement and education project, and you're doing data collection by having people submit measurements of heat. And I'm wondering how you successfully balance those two goals if you're trying to have people participate and give you data, but also get something out of it themselves. How do you make sure that you accomplish both of those things?
Oh, that's a great question. I will say that working with the Museum of Science was helpful in a lot of ways. They had done heat mapping in Boston the year before. And so I guess the logistics behind any big project maybe is the devil's in the details, as they say. So having had partners, being the Museum of Science that had already run it once, made it easier for us. So we had enough volunteers to map the whole place. People were enthusiastic. Social media and promotion on our website and through stories and all, I think helped to promote it. It was challenging in that, especially in the upper Mystic, to gather the data, you really needed a car. So youth, just by being excluded from drivers, weren't able to gather the data. So I would say there's that. On the other hand, they knew about it. It was something that we talked about with youth as well as with adults. There were plenty of volunteers, Nathan. I was surprised because it took a lot. The lower Mystic people were excited about doing it. I'd say that Mystic River Watershed Association is really well connected. And so the blast went out to a lot of people who have environmental interest. I would wonder about your question in terms of those who are not sort of seeing the same vision or understanding environmentalism. I would say that might be the place where some work could be done, is to attract a broader group. There was an effort, a big effort, to attract a broad group. But if environmental issues aren't your thing, it's hard to sign up for something like this. The other piece of gathering data is that we're also using, with the Museum of Science, the app I See Change. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So the
I'm
app,
not very familiar, no.
Okay, that's one to look up. I See Change. It's an app that it's a data gathering app. They ask you to take a picture and record data about weather, climate. So if you see trees leafing out at a time you wouldn't expect it, take a picture, submit. And so they gather that data, and I think they can map it so that they have that kind of data to also support not just the heat, because this was done on the 2 hottest days of the year. We waited. They couldn't gather the data until we had the hottest days over 90. And that was logistically challenging. But the I See Change app gathers data over time. So that the Mystic flood that I had the picture of earlier, images like that went on icy change. When we had the king tide and a big storm and tidal surge, those pictures went on icy change. So there was this other part of community data gathering that I think maybe is a little less useful, but the icy change team seems to think it is useful. So, I don't know. I'm not the scientist or the data gatherer or whatever, but icy change is also part of that. So, good question. Engaging students in this was something I would have liked to do, couldn't happen. It was the summer. We did a mock-up. It happened. I had a program that day outdoors on pavement, and we gathered data on the place where we were along the Malden River, the coolest places and the hottest places. So there was a way to connect students in that way, but it wasn't on this level. I don't know if I've answered your question, but I'm sure thinking about it.
I think you've excited us all about this app. So that's
Yeah,
that's
check it out for real.
no, I am. It's awesome. I'm sure there are other questions, but I just wanted to ask a little bit about, I'm here with a 6-year-old who said, the Charles River, I've heard of that. It's like, have you heard of the Mystic? We live very close to the Charles, so we'll give him that. But and he's like, I have now. But I was curious to if the Mystic Watershed Association has collaborations with other watersheds, say like the Neponset or something, where there's kind of broader sharing across maybe underrepresented watersheds.
I think that's a great question. And the answer for us is yes. We're connected to other watersheds in the area. The Charles and the Neponset this year released their watershed report cards. I showed you the watershed report card. It was a release of the three together. So, we blasted it out on social media. It was covered in the news media somewhere, somehow, that the three rivers together did it. So we do collaborate. We know a lot about the Charles, and the Charles knows a lot about us. And we try to collaborate when we can. Issues are similar but different. But yes, Merrimack River we're connected with. What else? I have to say that our executive director knows everybody. So yes, we're connected, I think.
Awesome. I think
Yeah, of course.
Suggesting you should reach out even across. She's in Oregon, and there's obviously similar watersheds.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. This past year and years before COVID, our organization always sent a cohort to what was it? It's not the Mass Rivers Alliance, which we're part of, but it's the national organization focused on rivers, whose name I'm blanking on. And we've been to the conference. We presented at the conference. We were awarded 2 things at the conference this year. 2 of my colleagues got recognition. So we try to be, I have to say, it's a tiny organization that's doing so much. You can't believe they're doing as much as they're doing. It's pretty remarkable, in my opinion. But I mean, there's always so much more that should be done, could be done, and sharing of information. And maybe I'll say, related to the Charles and the Mystic, every time I'm in a classroom, so I have thousands of students in my career at Mystic River I've dealt with. Every classroom I go in, I say, who has heard of or seen or knows about the Mystic River? Almost nobody. Sometimes the school will be sitting right on the shore of the river, and everybody's like, no, I don't know. I've never heard of that one. And then I always ask about the Charles, and people know the Charles. So I'm hoping over the 5 years that I have done this, that maybe the Mystic is a little better known, but it just is the unknown river.
Yeah, somehow they're too young for the movie, maybe, but yeah.
Yeah, right.
Because I feel like, yeah, fair enough.
Right. Well,
I think you really emphasized this in your talk, Marian, but I think that the relative prominence of the Charles and the Mystic is such an interesting example of how our choices in constructing our built environment lead to inequitable outcomes and access to recreation, access to the river. I mean, not just the industrial history of the usage, but in much more modern times, we made choices about putting the highway I-93 right along the Mystic River, so it's disconnected from so much of the community. Putting parking lots for the airport, which were constructed just a few decades ago, right along the river, so you don't have access to its banks. And those choices just weren't made with the Charles, and it disconnected communities that are poorer and less white from their river in a way that wasn't done for the richer communities along the Charles.
Oh, for sure. And I don't know, but it seems very purposeful. It's communities without clout and resources seem to have the industrial development in many ways. I mean, and we need industry. I'm not saying we don't, but there are so many pitfalls to that, and historical pitfalls. I mean, really, the Mystic was the river from the get-go, I believe, because of its physical attributes. It was deep enough. It was tidal enough. I mean, Charles was too, but it wasn't deep enough to support the kind of activities that people needed. So, and then I sort of, maybe, I don't know, spirals from there. I don't have an answer. I mean, the Mystic itself, highly industrial, but upriver, well, not even upriver, beyond at the beginning of the watershed, the Aberdeen River, highly polluted, really horribly polluted, not connected to the river per se. Industry sprung up there. There were tanneries that polluted the groundwater, that polluted the wells. There were chemical companies, and the same would be true in Cambridge and the Alewife area. So I don't know how we undo what got done. And I'm enough older than you guys that I would remember, the slogan, better living through chemistry. Like, people can solve every problem. We can chemical our way into everything. Plastic was the awesome material, this brand new awesome thing that could do anything, be anything. Yeah, it sounded great, but look, how many years later? So, that's a whole other philosophical problem. And I don't know how to answer that. But I'm glad people are thinking about it. And it feels like, your fellows in this program have some pretty good ideas. So, hey, kudos to everybody who's thinking about it and acting.
And I mean, education is such a key component. So we're delighted to have you involved and to have that kind of, at least, more present in the fellowship than it otherwise would be, sort of brought on by our fellows, but also your contributions. So I think, I think
well, thank you.
I was thinking about it is through education, and also youth education, especially. So.
For sure. Well, I often think that the answers to some of our problems, environmental and probably others, are going to be found with, 4th and 5th graders. Kids who are in 4th and 5th grade now, thinking about things where they have some skills, they have some experience, and maybe if we connect them to the local issues, they think outside the box. And that's a great thing to have happen. And they're exposed to it. Like, I wasn't exposed to these kinds of ideas as a kid, and that people are now, not just in the Mystic River, but across the board. Kids are considering problems and looking at solutions in, I don't know, I think interesting ways. And perhaps they'll be the ones to come up with really remarkable solutions. But they have to know about it. So you're right. We have to talk about it. We have to educate about it. And you know what? We're all learners. We're all educators. So anyway, I guess that's my education spiel. Thanks.
I think that's right on. I know we're just about at 5 Eastern. Are there any more questions from our fellows and guests that have joined? Okay. Well, if not, Marian, I just want to thank you again so much for sharing your time with us, for sharing this information. I'm excited to be able to post our recording that we've made so more people can see it as well. And I'm sure if anyone has questions for you after the meeting, they can reach out to Jill and I, and we can help them get in touch with you.
Oh, absolutely. And I put links in the chat, which I probably won't show up in the recording, right?
They'll be saved as part of the package, so I can post them as well. Yeah.
Right.
So
And it
they'll be-
was, okay, great. I thank you so much. This was a pleasure. I'm happy to share all this information with people. So thanks for having me.
Yes, excellent. Have a nice evening. Bye, everyone.
Okay, you
Thank you
too.
again. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.